I start, I do really want to acknowledge. You want your sheet back?
No, I'm going to get your slides up.
Oh.
Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
A lot of credit goes to Russell and Liz for this, and I just want to express my thanks for putting the Big Soil Health event on and everything, because it is this type of information that we need to get across, and the relationships that we form in all of this. The second one is to Taylor and Seth for moderating all of this and everything. So, but the biggest thanks goes to you. And the biggest thanks goes to you because a lot of what I talk about and everything are ideas that I've gleaned from your questions that you've asked over time. Because this whole process is a dialogue. It's not a one-way communication, it's actually a dialogue. And it's a journey of discovery. And it's a journey of discovery in terms of how do we bring these pieces together. The number one question I often get from producers is, where do I start? In all of this. And I said, just start. Just do something and figure out what's happening along the way as you go through the process. I also will tell you that if any of you want these slides, I'd be glad to send them to you at the end of the presentation and everything. My email address will be at the final slide, so you can request those. So don't feel that you have to take copious notes or wonder what in the heck was on that slide, because I'll give them to you and you can free to share them with your neighbors or sit around and have discussions with them or anything else. But we are going to talk about regenerative agriculture and what it means. And I'm going to do this from a perspective of really beginning to look. The principles of regenerative agriculture we've all talked about, we know in terms of keeping the ground covered, all of these different pieces that go into that. And we'll kind of discover these as we go along, but how do we begin this together? If we also think about this piece, which is NRCS's Principles of Soil Health, the only difference between regenerative agriculture and soil health is you notice one glaring omission. Anybody know what's missing between the last two slides? Livestock. NRCS doesn't have anybody that really works in livestock. We need to have that change attitude in terms of how do we think about this system as we go through that. But here's what we want to talk about, and that is that as we've begun to look at this overall process, and I look at regenerative agriculture from a different perspective in all of this, is that really we need to start thinking about where does regenerative agriculture think and impact the soil? How does it impact the field? How does it impact the farm? And how does it impact the landscape? Because too often in regenerative agriculture, we tend to have and think, well, what's that do to a specific soil within the field? And we don't think very holistically about how these things really become together. How do they begin to fit into the field dynamics, and how do they fit into the farm dynamics? And then ultimately, how do it really begin to impact the overall landscape? And I think this is the piece that we've got to start thinking about in the overall process. Ray mentioned, we have to start thinking ecologically, thinking in terms of context, all these other pieces. And I believe that we need to begin to think about how these really begin to work from an entirely different perspective. But if you look at it and you just boil it down in terms of what we're trying to do, is that we're trying to look and say, it has an impact in soil function. And soils really have three critical functions for agriculture. There are 14 functions that soils have if you look holistically, but there are only three that are really critical for agriculture: supplying water, supplying nutrients, and supporting that plant. You think about those three things. If we could optimize those three things, we're in great shape in terms of how do we look at the overall process. So when we think about it in this piece, you really begin to look at it and say, regenerative agriculture, so the soil profile, all of these different pieces coming together. And so in the short term, we think about this overall aspect of changing the dynamics out here, or really that the immediate short-term impact is changing the soil-water balance, and it changes the soil microclimate. The soil-water balance, because we put that cover on that, the first piece is we reduce the tillage intensity, we improve that cover out there. We see an immediate benefit on the water balance because we protect that soil from raindrop energy, we allow the infiltration to get in there, we reduce the evaporation in there. Once we change the water balance, we change the soil temperature very dramatically. We change all these different pieces coming together from that perspective. And so when you look at it, the short term, it's really about water. The long term, we begin to see all the other things that people talk about. We see aggregation, we see the soil gas exchange, we see water storage, we see all these different pieces coming together in terms of how do we look at this. And so you see that soil profile begin to change. We see that soil profile begin to change color and everything. And I think this is one of the pieces that we need to understand, is that we need to go out and look at what's happening in there. Take that spade and begin to look at it and say, you know, is there a color change in that? Because we see that influenced very quickly. And all of these other pieces come together because we are really dealing in a system that looks at it in an entirely different perspective. And so this process of change, and this is kind of the epiphany that I've had over the past 6 months to 8 months in looking at this process, is that we've gotten it entirely wrong because we tend to think, well, everything changes simultaneously. No, it doesn't. What we really begin to see when we begin to adopt these principles of reduced tillage and cover and diversity and livestock and everything else is the first thing that's changed is the water balance. And as we change the water balance, ultimately we then begin to change the carbon balance. We change the carbon dynamics of the system. And once we change the carbon dynamics of the system, we begin to influence the nutrient dynamics of the system. And so when you think about water, we can change that within days. That's a very quick response. We change carbon over the matter of weeks in terms of the process going on, and we change the nutrient cycling in terms of months. And there are feedbacks going in all of this. And this is the context that Ray talks about in terms of how do we understand how these cycles work? How do they really begin to influence each other? What are the feedbacks that exist between those? And I think as we begin to think about this, now you understand why soils change the way they do and why different soils change at different rates. And all of these pieces begin to fit together in terms of the dynamics that are going on. And if you look at it, just a simple little diagram, as we change and increase soil water because we increase the infiltration, we have more water stored, we have less water evaporated, so we make more water available to that plant. The more water we can make available to the plant, the more plant growth we have. The more plant growth we have, the more we can put into increasing carbon storage into that soil out there, because 50% of that photosynthate that is captured by that leaf ends up going out the root as exudates. And so we grow a bigger plant, we put more food in for the microbes. As we put more food in for the microbes, we go back and we increase plant growth again because we have better nutrient cycling. We change that whole soil water balance in terms of storing it. And so it's a big cycle that works. And you begin to think about this overall process that we made it by a simple change of influencing how much water we got into the soil. And we see that feedback going on in the overall process. And I think once we begin to understand that there is a very complex set of systems that work together, have a tremendous impact on each other in terms of this overall process, we can begin to work at that. So if you think about this piece, and this was a set of 3 water bottles that were collected by a high school student in eastern Kansas and everything, because it's a group that I work with. And he went out and they had a big rain and he was looking at the edge of the fields and he said, you know, So I collected these water bottles from a conventional tilled field and from a no-till field and from the cover crop field, and he put it on the hood of his pickup and said, you know, there's a lot of difference out there. An epiphany for a high school student to say, you know, there's differences in these systems that are going on, and when we have rain that occurs very rapidly, what's going on in terms of impacting out there? If we let these settle out, you can see how much sediment is in each of those as well. But I think it's that type of discovery that we need to look at and say, what has really occurred as a result of doing something on our fields out there. Here's just another piece of this, as that we've got very curious about how temperatures are changed out there. And so we looked and said, you know, what's the surface temperature that often occurs between corn and soybean rows early in the season out there? And if you get above 104 degrees or 40 degrees centigrade, we denature proteins. And so when we looked at the number of hours that soil was exposed to these temperatures over the course of different seasons out there, you see all these different things between corn and beans. You also looked at how many hours were above 86 degrees in terms of a cover crop system out there, and you find out that those are plotted on that same graph, but they're zero. So we didn't have any incursions above that level when we have a cover crop out there because we're all cool and everything else. So as we begin to look at this system, we have to realize that we change this. It's not uncommon for us to see soil temperatures, even in central Iowa, and in excess of 120 to 130 degrees Fahrenheit between the rows early in the season. Other parts of the country, I've been in places where we've worked, we've had 150 to 160 degrees between rows. That's where you can't walk on it barefooted. You can hardly touch that ground. So we actually have to think about not only do we changing that water balance, but changing the temperature aspects of this, because now we've created an environment because of the changes that we've made in regenerative agriculture, keeping it covered, keeping it more moist, all these different pieces fitting together. So if you look at this and you begin to understand that as we are in the whole energy capture business, that's really what we are, is that in all of this system, we're driving it by the amount of energy that we capture by that plant that's going above the surface, how much gets put below the surface, and I just put a different diagram of terms of rooting systems that are out there. And if you look at all of this, and I think we need to be paying attention not only to the diversity that's above the ground, but the diversity that's below the ground. The diversity that's below the ground in terms of either extracting nutrients and bringing it up, or taking photosynthate and exudates and moving it down into that profile to keep that microbial system fed. And so you look at all these different pieces that are coming together, is that we need to understand that diversity exists, and diversity is really how we need to think about this system from a different perspective. So the real question is, how does this profile of soil, a particular soil, and you can name your favorite soil, how does that change relate to the whole field? Because as we think about this field scale, we know that there are a number of different soils within that field. If you just look at this simple little diagram in terms of water holding capacity, and then all the different soils and their water holding capacity that's out there, you see all this variation that's occurring out there, and we see that there are different dynamics that are going on because as we change the water balance, we change how much stored in there, but ultimately we've got to think about how do we change this overall system. And so if you look at it from an entirely different perspective, and you look at that left diagram in terms of available water out there, as you move texture classes, we know all those changes that are going on. Hudson is a former SCS employee, before they changed their name, discovered that as we added more organic matter, we changed the available water holding capacity. And if you take and translate that available water holding capacity down to that bottom slide and say, what is that water worth to you? Is that when you go from 2% to 4% organic matter on a silt loam soil, you go from 8 to 13 days of available water during August on a corn crop. If you can go 5 more days and that crop isn't stressed, what is that? Profit, right? Because now you're plumping that grain out, you're filling that grain to its full potential and all of this. And we need to realize that as these systems are working, is that ultimately it comes back to that number one function of how do we supply water to that crop. That one function of the soil that's out there, because that is the most limiting factor in terms of crop productivity as we go together. If you think about this, these are data from Wayne Frederick's farms that we've worked on extensively. Wayne changed his whole systems back in 1993 to 2002 to go to strip-till and no-till beans, strip-till corn. And you look at all of this over time, I'll just bring it all together, is that we've changed the organic matter content from some fields by 3 to 6% in all of this. So we've had a tremendous impact in terms of changing the organic matter content. That's not the part that gets me excited. This is the part that gets me excited because we took each of those fields there and we analyzed the yield monitor data across from 2000 through to 2018. We actually added through 2022 that data set. But we looked at it from a perspective of saying what was that yield distribution within each of the soils that are out there. And if you look at that left-hand graph, you can see that there was a lot of yields that were pretty low in that distribution. And as we went through time, begin to see that we moved all those left-handed part of that yield distribution out. We made it tighter about the mean. And we see that across all the different soils out there. We were making that soil more uniform. We make the field more uniform in all of this, allowing each of the soils to express their full potential out there. And those green bars are basically profit. Anytime that I can take that left-handed distribution out and remove it, I'm adding profit into that soil out there. I'm adding profit into that field because we can now look at that system from an entirely different perspective. See, now you see the advantage of really what we're thinking about in terms of regenerative agriculture and realizing that we do change these dynamics. Producers that I've talked to that have been in this regenerative practices a long time do notice that their fields are becoming more uniform. Soils are becoming more uniform within their yield distribution. Profitability that gets changed along the way becomes a critical part of this overall process. So all of these different things fit together. If you look at it from this perspective, with the other analysis that we did is we looked at water use efficiency. Water use efficiency is basically how much grain did we produce per amount of water that fell as rain during the growing season out there. And we improved, this is Mitchell County on the red bar, and the tall bar is Wayne's data, is that we had an increase in water use efficiency because we were changing those soils as well. And so now we're getting more yield within each of those soils out there, making more advantageous use of every drop of water that fell. But we also saw, as we began to change the system, is that we broke a correlation. And we broke this correlation, well, we broke two of them. One is that anytime that it rains excessively during April and May is the lower average county yield. We delay planting, we drowned out spots in fields, all these different things that are going on. And so we see that changed because we could plant earlier, we could plant on time, we didn't have the drowned out spots because we changed the water dynamics and all of this. The other piece, the other correlation we broke is that the more it rains in July and August, the higher the average county yield. Makes sense. That's the highest water use demand period. The more it rains there, we take care of those really poor soils within that because they have water available to them. So you look at all these different pieces in all of this, and we begin to see that as we change these systems, we no longer see these relationships because we have the water stored, we have the availability, we're not delaying planting. All of these different pieces that come together in terms of these dynamics. And so when we start looking at the field scale, we do see these changes that are going on. We also saw this, and that fact that as we went over time, is that there was less nitrogen required to produce that crop out there. Yields were going up, we really didn't change nitrogen rates, but we got more yield for every amount of nitrogen that's out there. So we start looking at nitrogen use efficiency, finding out that we do change these systems. So when we look at all this, but I really believe that this is a problem, is that we undervalue the changes that occur within the field. We tend to think, well, it's changed within the soil, but we don't really think about the field scale changes to the degree in which I believe we need to. And so when we start looking at these field scale changes, I think we got to start looking and saying, what sort of information do we have to allow us to make this decision? We can see yield, all of you have yield maps, or most of you have yield maps. I think one of the things that we're missing is how do we layer those yield maps over years to begin to look at the dynamics of a field. And I know that's difficult in terms of a lot of this because of different pieces of the puzzle. I think we're going to have to build software that makes it very easy to take and import yield maps, layer them up, and analyze these data very quickly. And so you can look and say, you know, as I've gone through 5 or 6 years of transition, what's really changing within that field? Or even if you haven't transitioned, how do I understand what's going on within that field? Because we have information, but we need to capture the power of that information and make it available to us from that standpoint. The other piece of this is that we have techniques now that allow us to really look at that field from a different perspective in terms of some of the remote sensing. I've worked in remote sensing from 1975 when I've got my PhD all the way through to now, and we have the same fascination with the remote sensing today as we had in 1975, and that's the fact that we can create a pretty picture. We can create a map. People are always fascinated with maps, and I mean, I can create one of the most fantastic maps with all of this, but it has no information value to it. It's really kind of a nice picture. And so I think there's a lot of places we have techniques that we use this, and I'll show you a couple as we go along. And as we start comparing all of this over time, I do believe that we need to start looking and saying, what's really happening within our field? And what are the metrics that we can look at and say, how does this begin to fit together from that perspective? And so we need to understand that there are a lot of pieces that are happening in all of this. This is just one example. I pulled out this is Sentinel-2 data that comes out. It's a publicly available data source. This is a capture out of eastern Kansas that I've been working on. This is the moisture index across that over the past year, and you can see all this variation in moisture index because of rain and the crop running out of water and everything else. So it gives us some dynamics in all of this. This is another one. This is a light interception graph. This is what this parameter really tells you, is how much that area is intercepted in light. And you can go from over a year, and you can see that over the winter we've got very low intercepted light because we have very little stuff growing out there. There's all those data points that are below this because of cloud cover and everything else. I didn't screen that data out to make it look pretty. But this is the power of what we have, and we can go in now in fields and begin to look and say, how do we begin to look at information from an entirely different perspective and tell us what's happening before we ever get to yield monitor. I think as we begin to build information data sets and focus it on the parameters relative to regenerative agriculture, that we can open up some new ways in which we can analyze fields, look at fields from a different perspective, look at some of the things that are going on. Ray talks about the metrics that are out there, and I believe the metrics are within our grasp. But we're going to have to start figuring out how do we bring them together and then interpret them relative to what's going on out there. So we have all sorts of new technologies. I'm very fascinated about some of the new technologies that we have in terms of the processes that are out there. We've got drones, we've got all these different things, but I think that most of the time that we're using them as survey tools and not as data gathering and information generating tools. And I think this is really where we have to get to, is how do we take and begin to look at this from a different perspective. And so how do we get new soil sensors out there? I mean, there's a number of different things that are happening in all of this. But here's the other piece of this, and I think that all of you now, in terms of looking at this, and I'm a big fan of on-farm experimentation. And I just want to show you one piece of this, and I'm going to give credit to Carolyn King. Carolyn, raise your hand. Carolyn is, I was her master's student advisor, and so don't ask her about, what level of advisor I was and all of this, but we had access to a data set, or Carolyn had access to a data set that was collected at Brian and Mitchell's farm on cover crops versus no cover crops across strips, and you see all these different pieces that are going on. A very intensive sampling set because the Haney test was taken every week from the time frost went away until frost started in the fall. So it's a very complete data set. I just want to show you a couple different slides in all of this. Carolyn will be glad to give you a whole hour presentation on her on her thesis, won't you, Carolyn? Absolutely. Oh yeah, absolutely. And so here's just all of this because we saw some very fascinating things, but I just wanted to show you that here's the difference between a cover crop, no cover crop in terms of the CO2 respiration going out that comes out of the Haney test. And we just separated out at different stages of the sampling pieces out there. In every case, you can see that the cover crop was advantageous over the no cover crop, and then you saw a health score where you aggregate a lot of different pieces that come in, as well as that you begin to see these pieces. But here's the power that we have of doing on-farm experimentation. We have the capabilities of being able to statistically analyze these type of data now, to be able to look at it and say, really what's happening within a soil, what's happening within that overall strip within that field. We can begin to look at this and say, can we really compare product A versus product B? Yes, we can. We had another experiment that we ran in eastern Kansas in which we were putting a biological onto native prairie to look at the impact of it. We increased the productivity of that grass by 900 pounds, which would actually equivalent to being able to almost double the stocking rate on that pasture. But the bigger fascinating thing is that we improved total digestible nutrients and crude protein by 30%. I think we need to start looking at different parameters of how do we begin to bring these systems together. How do we evaluate them? And so don't be shy about running strip trials on your fields. And don't let anybody tell you that we have to use a randomized complete block design in all of this, because I'm not a big fan of randomized complete block designs because, full disclosure, my PhD is I have a minor in statistics. But I have a minor in statistics on spatial and temporal analysis, not on experimental design, but on how do we use new techniques, begin to analyze these data. And now we have the tools ahead of us to be able to look at this. And so you say you want to run a strip trial across there? We can figure out how to run a strip tile, and we can look at it by soils within the field. We can look at all these different dynamics. There are powers within your hands that allow you to say, I can become my own experimentalist, and I can figure out what's going on and know whether that has an impact or not. Now I want to move to the farm scale, because as we've gone from a soil profile to a field to a farm out there, I think farm now really gets into this overall piece. And that overall piece in terms of these dynamics is, how do we begin to look at this system? And as we begin to look at this system from an entirely different perspective, is that all fields are not the same. Each field soil is going to respond differently in there, so each field is going to respond differently, so the farm is going to respond differently. So each producer needs to evaluate their own individual fields for responses to changes. That's going back to this on-farm experimentation. The overall effect on the on-farm decisions really becomes part of the labor piece, becomes part of the market piece, all of these different things. And so when you get to the farm scale, it is the ultimate in terms of sociology and psychology. Now we're moving into not moving from a physical, chemical, and biological system, but much more into the sociology and the psychology of all of this. And so the farm scale brings in a different context of how do we have to think about this system. But it's also the point in which you have got different decisions to make. The different decisions in terms of this overall process. Because as we look at this system, we have an opportunity for community. We undervalue the power of groups of people to do things. And I believe in the regenerative process is built on community. The regenerative process is built on community in terms of being able to say what worked for you, what didn't work. Have you tried this? Have you not tried that? Always fascinated walking around and just listening to the types of dialogues that go on in these meetings. Because they're always about, have you tried this? Or what do you think about that? And I think this is one of the pieces that we've got to understand is that we are a community in terms of looking at how these systems come together. The other piece of this is that last one in terms of we only change when the pain of changing is less than the pain of remaining the same. We don't like to change. Change scares us, right? Be honest. We don't like to change. But in reality, we need to think about what's the process of transition. Let's not think about a process of change, let's think about a process of transition. How do I get from A to B? The community piece of this has been undervalued. The community piece of this, I'm always fascinated to talk to regenerative agriculture audiences versus conventional agriculture audiences. Regenerative agriculture audiences, and you pick up the dialogue and they're always willing to share. Conventional audiences want to come in, hear the information, and they want to keep it to themselves. There's not a lot of sharing that goes on about the overall processes that are out there, and believe me, I've spoken to a lot of different groups in these systems. And here's where I think the opportunities lie. The opportunities lie in being able to begin to understand that we can add additional crops into this system. I think the real opportunity lies in saying, what can we do to a lot of this? Right now I work on a whole project and looking at winter oil seeds in terms of fitting it into crop rotations in all of this. So, and in the arid West, we're looking and saying, can we replace fallow with an oilseed crop? And you look at all that different pieces going on. The other piece of this is this integration of livestock. How many people have livestock today that didn't have livestock 10 years ago? Not as many as I thought. You have livestock because you saw an opportunity, right? You saw an opportunity in terms of this overall piece of this puzzle, in terms of this. What's fascinating about this and what bugs me about the principles of soil health is that when you start talking to producers about the rate of change that's going on in terms of cover crops, and then when they added livestock into that cropping system and either using it for forage or anything else, how much more rapidly their soil changed when they added livestock into the system. You begin to understand the power of manure. The power of adding that optimally balanced carbon-nitrogen ratio excreted by livestock that goes back into the systems to feed the biology. That integration of livestock had a tremendous impact in all of this. And so I think here's some of the opportunities that we have, but we haven't really thought about them from a very strong perspective in all of this. But now I want to take you beyond the farm. I want to take you now to the beyond the farm impact in all of this. This is my concept of the ecosystem and ecosystem services. I just happened to put together a much more complex diagram than Ray did. And so if you look at all of this and you look across that center bar, we talk about all the different things that happen within a system, whether it be crops or livestock or trees or fruit or anything else. And they're bound on either side by temporal dynamics, where it's placed, by the spatial dynamics, where it is on the livestock, where it is on the landscape. All of this is going on, but around the side is that whole body is the ecosystem, but those four corners are the ecosystem services. In agriculture, we generally value one ecosystem services, and that's provisioning, is how much we produce. But in reality, we're going to have to start to change our thinking and start thinking in an ecosystem of what do we get in terms of habitat and all of this. What do we get in terms of regulating water quality? What do you get in terms of the social value of all of that out there? And the social value could be the quality of the food that's produced, a number of different things that go with that. And so it became my whole goal in creating this diagram was to create a diagram that nobody could take apart and say, I just worked on this piece. It's really to say that we have got to approach this problem from a holistic point of view, a contextual point of view, and saying, you know, I've got to bring all these pieces together and think about them simultaneously in terms of being able to really optimize what we want for agriculture, what we want for society, and what we want for the environment. We've got to move away from the stovepipes and start thinking about the overall piece of this puzzle as we go together. And so this agriculture and ecosystem is really about energy flows. We've been working on a whole concept of really how much energy do we put into the system, where does it go, what's it do, what's it take to create resilience into the system, and all of this. And so it really becomes a process that we have to bring these pieces together from a different perspective. And I'll just use the one example for ecosystem services, and that is just a few little gullies and a little water runoff out of there, because we can take all of that water and we can channel it and we move it and we move that soil off and we cause all these different problems. This is from the Iowa Daily Erosion Project, 2001 and 2021, or 2007, 2021. You can see differences among the years in the amount of erosion that's out there. But you look at those graphs out there, we're seeing 7 tons, 10 tons of soil loss across parts of Iowa out there. That doesn't even include what we lost in terms of carbon going back up. That's just the erosion process that's happening out there. And this is just the water erosion piece. Here's the other piece of this, is that in the American Farmland Trust, in their analysis in 22, is this is the amount of area of the United States is susceptible to water stress. Water is going to become our number one problem of how we manage into the future. How do we capture it? How do we make it available and put it back through that crop? How do we keep it from moving down the stream? How do we keep it on the field? And all of this is going to be our number one piece, because it is the number one impact on productivity. And so if we want to sustain yields around the world, it's really about focusing on how do we manage the water as part of this system. Nutrients will tag along as we go with this. Ecosystem services in all of this, I mean, the only ecosystem services we really talk about right now is carbon markets, and those are iffy in my opinion in all of this, is that we need to keep water in place on the field because that directly will benefit you, benefits all these other things downstream as well. I've driven across the Midwest several times lately. I've yet to see a clear river, and you know, it's even worse in the spring. And all of this. So we're really going to have to think about how do we keep water in part of the landscape, because that benefits us. You've heard Mitchell talk about carbon intensity scores. I think this has become one of our new metrics in terms of how do we look at systems out there. The carbon intensity score is just basically how much grain, forage, fruit, or anything else we produce relative to the carbon inputs in all of this. And it's an entirely different metric in terms of how do we look at the success of that system, particularly for renewable energy. And then how do we begin to change the ecosystem relative to the carbon intensity score? Because as we improve the soil, we reduce that. We make that system much more efficient in all of this. I think this becomes part of this overall metric that we can begin to look at, and we're working on tools that we can really easily calculate that. But here's where I think the opportunities lie. The opportunities lie in being able to evaluate these practices, evaluate regenerative practices to restore and enhance functionality, storing water, cycling nutrients, providing support for that plant, the aggregation part of the process. We now have the tools to be able to do on-farm studies very quickly, be able to analyze those, compare those, and begin to say, is A different than B? In all of this. I think the other piece of this is how do we begin to evaluate this process, because it's an adaptive management, continuous improvement process. Businesses, you've used this for a long time. You basically adapt something, you evaluate it, you retweak it, and everything else. That's what farming has been forever. But we just never put that terminology to it, and we didn't understand the metrics. But I do think the biggest part of this puzzle as we go forward, and here's where the opportunity lies, is how do we form communities? How do we form communities to be able to share experiences, share successes, share failures, all these different pieces in all of this? We've had one community that we built in eastern Kansas, we call the Prairie Soil Pioneers. It's 15 producers that have cover crops, both the cash grain, we have cover crops as part of the rotational grazing, winter stocking programs and things like this. We're looking at forming another community that works on native prairie in the Flint Hills, Texas, all the way from Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas, Missouri, and all of these as we go forward, because I think this is the overall piece. But then the other piece of this, I think, in the opportunity is we need to develop an attitude of transformational agronomy. Transformational agronomy is a term that I came up with in 2020 because I had nothing else to do other than sit around and think, is that in transformational agronomy is really about how do we transform the system most efficiently, most effectively, and be able to achieve the goals that we want for that. I do believe that everyone in this room needs to sit down and write out what your 5-year goals are. Well, I'll start with what your 1-year goal, what your 5-year goals, and what your 10-year goals are. And how those goals match with how you're going to transform your system along a journey to get there. It's eye-opening when you begin to say, you know, these are the goals that I want, these are the goals that are out there. And here's your challenges. Your challenges are really pretty simple. To me, they're simple. To you, they're probably, oh, that. You have to realize that there is no one solution and there's no simple answer. We're dealing with Mother Nature that is a very complex set of interactions that go on. And we are very poor at understanding interactions. So there's no simple answer out there, because one thing works one way and doesn't work something else doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means that there's different parameters driving that. We have to realize that farming exists in a genetics by environment by management complex. By that I mean we have to realize that we have management systems that interact with the environment, that interact with the genetics out there in terms of how they express themselves in terms of productivity. I think as we build those tools out and we begin to understand how those fit together, we understand now how different management practices can be advantageous for us in different ways. And the other piece of this is I believe we need much more innovation and much more creativity. There's no such thing as a bad idea. They just may not work, but there's no such thing as a bad idea. Because what's a bad idea in one place may be a great idea in something else. A great technique in some place may not work the same everywhere, but we have to understand that let's not dismiss it right away. Let's begin to think much more creatively about this problem. How do we begin to get the principles of regenerative agriculture, reducing tillage, the cover crops, the diversity, integrating livestock? How do we think about that from a much more creative system than what we have? Because I think that becomes our opportunity. That becomes our opportunity of how we're going to meet the challenge that everybody says we can't meet, and that's feeding the world. You know, how are you going to feed that 10 billion people that are out there? What I worry about is not our ability to feed the 10 billion people. What I worry about is our total lack of regard for the fragile nature of the ecosystem that it takes to produce that food. We undervalue our soil, we undervalue our water, and we undervalue our genetic resources. But the most thing that we undervalue is our human ability to solve this problem. We undervalue our potential creativity to adopt new practices, to try new things, to bring things together, and begin to work on this as a community that really begins to understand that we have a challenge and that we can begin to look at this. And so with that, here's my contact information. Feel free to email me and request a slide set if you want. You can always text me at that number. If you call me, it'll always go to voicemail.